Hello everyone and welcome to this video. I am Fuad Alavi and this is the fourth video of the series of clean architecture that I prepared for you. In this video we are going to store the data. We have one handler here and we want to save data in it. But before jump to writing code, let's start with the task that I gave you about checking all the packages inside the application and make this project runnable. Let me build my application. As you can see, it is showing an error and it says that you are having and using one package in the librarian.api, but this package, it has a version. For resolving it, you need to copy this package reference, go back to the directory packages and paste it here. And you need to replace the package reference with package version. Let me format it, save it, go back here to my librarian.api and get rid of this version. Now, if I build my project again, you will see that there is no error. Yeah, don't care about this error, it will disappear. Let me build it again for you. Okay, now it is gone on the second build. Before I start writing code here, I need to talk about clean architecture and where to place files. Clean architecture is like a guardrail for us. It shows us exactly where to put files. And if I want to persist something, I need to have some interfaces for a repository. Let's assume that I have one iGeneric repository and I'm going to use it. Where should I place the interface? Should I place the interface inside the persistent layer, or I should place it in my application layer? There is a golden rule. The rule said that if you have an interface and the interface is getting used and implemented in more than one layer, you should place it in application. Then if we have one interface, as an example, the repository, and I'm going to use it here in my application layer, and I want to implement it in the persistence layer, I have to place it somewhere in my application. But before doing that, I can see that my namespace here is librarian.application.feature.commands, but it should be librarian.application.features member commands. Let's change it by change namespace to match the folder structure, and now we are safe to start. Then all the contracts and interfaces should be placed somewhere in my application. How to do that and where to place it? Let's start by creating a folder here and call it contracts, and create another folder under this one and call it persistence, because we may have some other contracts which are related to some other part of the application. Maybe I need to have some other contracts for infrastructure layer. We don't know that. Then it is better to create folders to organize the code which are related to each layer or each part of your application. I need to create my generic repository now. Let's create the interface for it and implement it. I'm going to create one interface and let's call it iGeneric repository. It should be generic, then we should pass a type to it. And now it is time to put some conditions for the type. Should we pass any type that we want to this repository? Of course not. We should only be able to pass domain models to this repository. Then we need to write a varchar and say t when it is a type of class. No, not class. A type of entity. And because I'm using a generic entity, we should find a type which applies to all my domain models. As you can remember, I have one base entity and all my entities are inheriting from this base entity. Then it is safe to assume that all the types which are going to be accepted by my generic repository should be of type base entity. Let me get rid of unnecessary usings and put some code in here. I need to have a method with name getAllAsync. It is going to return a task IReadOnlyList. It is going to return a list of something. This something can be member, can be author, can be book, depending on the type that we are going to pass to it. Get by ID async, it is accepting an ID and returning just one item. And we have 3 other methods for creating, updating, and deleting async. And each of these methods is going to accept one entity of type T. Let's reformat it again. And now we can start. But before jumping back to my handler, I like to create one specific repository or one specific interface for each domain model that I have. You may think that it is overkilling. We have one generic repository and we can do whatever we want with it. But trust me, just wait for some sessions and some other videos. You will realize this separation of concerns will help us in organizing a good code. And as I told you, clean architecture is equal to a guardrail for writing code. Then let's create it. Inside the persistent folder, I'm going to create another item, interface, and let's call it IMemberRepository. By adding that, I can just inherit from my iGeneric repository. iGeneric repository accepts a type. I can pass it T, but it is meaningless because I want it to be specifically for my domain model, which is called member. Then let's call it domain.member. I'm going to pass this type to the generic repository. Then the member repository doesn't need to accept any kind of parameters as a type. And let's get rid of the unnecessary usings and go back to my handler. Inside my handler, first I need to inject my repository. My repository is IMemberRepository, and let's call it repository and create one read-only field for it. I have an error. It says that the permission level, the access type that I have for this repository is less than public because we have a public class and we are passing something to it which is not public, I guess. Let's go back here, and yes, it is internal. Let's make it public. And again, go back here. The error should go. Yeah, it is gone now. Here, I just want to add something. Let's start doing that. I have the request. Request has all the properties that I want to save. Then let's pass it. I need to await it first and call repository and create a sync. And then I can pass something to it like request. But if I want to pass request to it, it says that cannot convert from type librarian blah 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 something create member request to librarian domain member. The check that I put in iGeneric repository was to make sure that I'm not making mistakes like that. For creating one member, I need to convert request to my domain model. For now, let's just write some code for it, something like that, var add to item and instantiate a new instance of domain.member and just pass all the fields and properties that I have inside my request to this new item and save it. Okay, we did it. The good point here is without knowing how we are going to store it inside the database, and even without creating anything to store it inside the database, we wrote our code. Imagine that you are working in a company and we have some teams which are responsible to developing the application layer and some other teams which are responsible for creating the persistence layer for you. You don't need to know how they are going to implement that. Even you don't need to know if they have implemented that module or not. You just need to have access to one interface and run your code and execute it against that abstraction. It is the miracle of abstractions. Okay. But eventually we need to implement it. Let's go back to the persistence layer and use entity framework for storing it inside my database. Let's start by adding entity framework package to my persistence layer. Let me go to the NuGet package manager and search for Microsoft.entity framework core.sql server and just download it. By accepting that, and going back to my project.cs file, you will see that it is included here, MS SQL Server, without any version. And if I check my directory.packages.properties, I will see that it is added here with the version. Let's save everything and close our tabs that I have open. Now I'm going to create a DbContext and after that implement my repository. For creating a DbContext, it is better to create a folder, call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it contexts because I might need more than one DbContext. Place it there and then create another folder with name repositories and put all my repositories there. Let's generate it context, and after that I can create a file and call it library and DbContext. Fine, it should be public, and of course it should inherit from DbContext, from entity framework. Do not forget that when you are inheriting from DbContext, you need to create a constructor method for this library and DbContext, and in that constructor method you need to pass the DbContext options to the base class. It should be something like this. I need to have the constructor, I need to pass a DbContext options. The option should be from the type library and DbContext, and then call the base method. We are passing some information between the context, library and context, and DbContext like connection string, and all these options will be stored in this argument. We have 3 domain models, and for each of these 3 domain models, I need to create one property from type dbSet. dbSet is exactly a mapping of a table that I'm going to create, or I already have inside the database, to my entity framework DbContext. Let's remove the empty spaces and remove unnecessary usings and start writing the repositories. But before doing that, during your development, you need to check if the references between the projects are correct or not, because Visual Studio by default tries to make your life easier by adding the references and adding the usings. Then it is highly probable that you have one class in more than one project and you want to point at something else, and Visual Studio decides that it needs to reference another one. Then you can have access to API layer inside the persistence layer, which is not what we want. For checking that, you need to right click on your solution, go to project dependencies, and inside the project dependency from this combo box, you can select the project that you have. I have API. API just has a dependency to the application, which is correct. The application has dependency to domain, which is correct. Domain should not have any dependency, which is correct. Infrastructure has dependency just to application, and the persistence needs to have dependencies to the application. Okay, fine. There are some test libraries to test these dependencies between the frameworks and between the projects, but I personally don't use them because it doesn't have any benefit for me. I'm just going to check it like that because, I'm lazy. If there is no benefit in writing a code, I'm not going to write it. Let's start again with generating some repositories. Repository folder, and I have 2 repositories, one generic repository and another one a specific member repository. Create a class and call it generic repository. It should be public. This generic repository should implement my interface IGeneric repository. Let me paste it here, and it is nagging because if the interface is generic, we should have a generic class as well. And now we should be able to just add the using. It is not going to add the using for me. I'm not sure why. Let's get rid of all unnecessary usings. We still have another issue. The issue is that if I hover on that, it says that we should have a condition for repository. We set a condition for interface. Then we need to write exactly the same condition here for the repository as well, that T should be from type the common base entity. Okay, fine. Where T is from type base entity. And now it should work. Let's implement the code, implement the interface. Apparently I cannot implement it because it says that the access level of this file is something like internal. Let's make it public and go back to my repository. Now it should let us to just implement the code. Yes, let's implement the interface. Well, I need to have my DbContext here. Then I need to inject it. Let's create a constructor using ctor, and then I can say librarian DbContext. Let's call it DbContext or context. Let's stick to the context and create a field, read-only field for me. Good. And I can create, update, and delete my entities here. For saving the time, I'm going to write the code here for you and paste it here and then explain it, something like that. Okay, I have create async from type T. It is going to first get access to the table that we have. We can get access to the specific table or entity using context by calling the set method of type T and add the entity to that set of data or to that entity and then calling save change. As you can see here, we are calling context.set almost in all my methods here. Then maybe it is a good refactor if I put it inside one field, something like that. Underscore dbset equal context.set and create one generic read-only field for it. Fine. And let's replace all of these calls to underscore dbset. As you know, I'm super lazy and Visual Studio helps me with that. When I just click on it, it says tab to change it to dbset. Okay, good. And another tab to go to the next and another tab just to change it. There are just some things that we need to explain here. For get all async and get by ID async, I am using as no tracking. As no tracking is something for entity framework itself. I'm not going to explain it in this video. In future, I'm going to explain entity framework in details. Using this method, just remove some overheads on each of the entities because the context will be disconnected here in our case because we are using one web application. Use tracking is useful, especially in times that your context is not going to be disconnected and you don't need to use a detached context. Okay, forget it. I will explain it later for you. Now that I have this generic repository, it is time to create my member repository. And let's just create an item here and call it member repository. This member repository should be public and it should inherit from generic repository. Yes, and generic repository of type domain.members. Let me just inherit from generic repository and implement IMember repository. IMember repository. Fine. It is nagging because we have one constructor which accepts one parameter and it doesn't have it. Then let's create a constructor exactly like that with having this context here and pass it to the base method. Fine. And let's save everything. Okay, I guess it is all for this session. Let's wrap up what we learned. In this session, we learned that if we have any kind of interface or contract that we can use in more than one layer, we should place it inside the application layer. We learned that by doing that, we can have two different teams. One of them just develop the code for the application and the other just implement my repository. And by using this method, you can hide the implementation of your database level and persistence layer from the application layer. Then in future, if you want to change storing from database to some files, which is not really meaningful, you can change it without changing your code in application layer. Okay, thanks a lot for watching this video. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. And by hitting the bell, you will get notified when I upload a new video about this series or maybe my new videos about some other series. Enjoy your life as a developer and keep practicing.